Let's talk about the most effective ways to introduce or integrate quotations in academic writing. And the way you do that typically is with what's called a signal phrase. So signal phrase, and signal phrase is your own words that introduce the quotation, that give some context, and that basically allow the reader to have a sense of what the quotation is about, who is speaking, what's in it, and the signal phrase then allows us to make sense of the quotation and integrates that passage smoothly into your own writing. So to give some examples here of different signal phrases, we've used this rather contentious opinion from a made-up source, Save the Pets by Gilbert Cates, and we're going to look at a number of patterns for how to quote from this passage. Our first pattern is what's called the short expression, and what this consists of is a subject, often the author you're quoting, and then we have a verb, and the verb is what's sometimes called a verb of expression. So these are verbs such as argues, or states, or insinuates, or implies, or suggests, verbs that show that the author is expressing some kind of opinion. And you can see that here we have writes, there's our verb of expression. We also have Cates. Cates is our author who is doing the expressing. And that's really all we need in the simplest form for a short expression signal phrase. So after that, we're going to add our comma. And then we have the quotation. So our quotation here is a complete sentence. Complete sentence. As a result, it starts with a capital. And then at the very end, we're going to get rid of the final punctuation. Okay, so any final punctuation such as a comma, a period, or a semicolon, we get rid of it. And we replace it with our own period at the very end after the citation. Notice also that we have a space between the quotation mark and the citation. And there's two little exceptions to what we've just talked about that you need to know. So if there's an exclamation mark in the quotation or a question mark, then you would keep that here as well. You would still add your final period too. And if you don't have a citation, then what you can do is you can just put your period inside the quotation marks. But that's fairly rare in academic writing because we do typically want to cite our sources. We're using obviously the MLA style guide here, but you can cite in other ways as well. So if you were to cite, let's say the Chicago Manual of Style and use a footnote, then probably you'd be using this pattern, and you can add your little 1 or whatever footnote number you're at after the quotation. Now notice that your short expression doesn't have to be that short. So if you look at the next example here, we have at the core still our subject and we have our verb of expression, but we have lots of other information as well before we get to our comma and our quotation. Okay, so you're not restricted to just this really short introductory phrase, but you can elaborate on the pattern a little bit. Finally, notice the use of as in this pattern. Often people will start with as so-and-so argues. So that's a common way to introduce a quotation. The second pattern we'll have a look at here is what's called the formal introduction. And as the name implies, this is a signal phrase that has a little bit more weight to it. So it's a signal phrase that's often longer. It doesn't have to have that verb of expression in it, but it's a kind of statement. It often summarizes the quotation which follows afterwards. So you can see here that we have said there is one question PETA supporters often face, and then the quotation is that exact question. Similarly, in the second example, some critics believe that PETA is inconsistent in its use of Darwinian principles. You can see we have this fairly elaborate, complete sentence. The sentence tries to summarize something about what the quotation is saying, and it introduces the quotation that way. Okay, so the key then to our signal phrase is that we have a complete sentence. We don't just have a short tag that has a verb of expression in it, but we have a nice complete sentence, and then we have a colon, which carries a bit more weight than a comma, and then we're going to get our quotation. Now notice again that our quotation is also a complete sentence in this pattern, and because of that, because in the original we started with, or we had a lowercase I, we've used square brackets to make this into an uppercase I, and you're definitely allowed to do that. So we have our complete sentence, then we have our citation, and we have a period. Notice that in the second example, we often use formal introductions with a block quotation. So a block quote is a passage of 4 or more lines of text, and a block quote is fairly long, and if you're going to use a longer quotation, then it better be important, right? You don't want to waste the reader's time by quoting long stretches of text without it having anything to do with your argument. But because the quotation is quite long, the reader is also going to struggle a bit with the contents of the quotation unless you kind of summarize what's coming up. And that's why with block quotations, we typically want to use a formal introduction to really give a good sense of what's being said here. Our third type of signal phrase is the running quotation, and this is our last major pattern as well. A running quotation is where your signal phrase runs directly into the quote with no intervening punctuation. Okay, so there's no comma, no colon in between, and instead your signal phrase and the quote form one complete sentence. So if you were to take the quotation marks off, if you got rid of them, you should be able to read all of this as one complete sentence. And notice that's why we have the lowercase t here. This used to be a capital T, but we've used square brackets to turn into a lowercase t in this case. Incidentally, you don't want to use square brackets too often, so sometimes you may want to use a different kind of introduction just so you can avoid the use of square brackets. If you look at the last example here, you'll notice that one thing you can do with this kind of quotation is you can continue after the quote. Typically, when we quote a passage, we just want to put a period behind it. We don't want to keep going, but if you want to experiment, if you're more adventurous, and if your quotation is fairly short, then you can keep your sentence going sometimes afterwards. But try to do that just with this kind of pattern, mostly, and really check, if you were to take the quotation marks off, that all of this can still be one complete sentence. Let's end with a few minor variants that we haven't covered yet. So these are more exceptional kinds of signal phrases. So I would tend to stick with the major patterns that we've talked about, but occasionally you may want to experiment a bit and try out these variants. One thing you can do is you can add an extra quote or two after your first one. So if you look at this one, it says the death of human beings, and then we have some of our own words, and we have a second quotation afterwards. If they're from the same page, then you would just put one page number after the last one. If they're from different pages, then you would have to add a separate citation after this one. So let's say this was from page 98. You would put the citation right after the final quotation marks there. Okay, so that's one thing you can do. You can add an extra quote afterwards, but be very careful. Try to do this only with shorter quotations and make sure that they are nicely integrated, that the syntax of your sentence keeps things going smoothly. Two final ones here. You can delay the signal phrase, and you can do that either by sticking it in the middle or you can stick it at the very end. So we'll call this an inverted signal phrase, and then the last one is a delayed signal phrase. I would be hesitant to do this too often, especially in academic writing, because as soon as you delay your signal phrase, what happens is that the reader doesn't quite know what to make of the quotation until they get to that signal phrase. And any kind of delay makes it harder for the reader. So if you're okay with that, if you like to keep your reader in suspense a bit, that's fine. But if you really want to help your reader out, it's usually best to put your signal phrase at the beginning. This type of signal phrase, an inverted or delayed signal phrase, is probably more common in formats like newspapers. Okay, but in academic writing, I would tend to stay away from it. So that's it for signal phrases. Try them out yourself. Try to vary your writing a little bit. And I think if you do that, you'll be able to write more more freely, and you'll be able to introduce your quotations in a way that's smooth and coherent.